His face was frozen in terror for 3,000 years, not peaceful, not serene, mouth stretched open in an eternal scream, features twisted in absolute agony. This is not how pharaohs were supposed to rest. Egyptian royalty were meant to sleep peacefully through eternity, prepared for their journey to the afterlife with dignity and honor. But this mummy breaks every rule. Look closer at that expression. That's not the face of someone who died gently. That's the face of someone who knew what was coming. And what the ancient embalmers did to his body tells us they wanted everyone to remember his crime forever. The year is 1881. The place, Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor. A secret tomb has just been uncovered, and what archaeologists find inside will be called the greatest discovery of the 19th century. 40 royal mummies hidden away in a cramped chamber carved deep into the cliffsides. These aren't just any mummies. These are the kings who built an empire. Ramesses the Great, whose reign defined Egyptian power for 66 years. Seti I, the warrior pharaoh who expanded Egypt's borders and commissioned some of the most magnificent temples ever constructed. Thutmose III, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. An entire dynasty of god kings wrapped carefully, their names inscribed on their coffins, their faces peaceful in eternal rest. But among these honored rulers, there was one that didn't belong, cataloged simply as unknown man, no name, no titles, no royal cartouche identifying his lineage. The archaeologists who first examined him were immediately unsettled. His wrappings were different, his position was wrong, and that face, that horrible, screaming face, they had never seen anything like it. To understand why unknown man is so disturbing, you need to understand what Egyptian mummification meant. This wasn't just preservation. This was the most sacred ritual in their entire civilization. The journey to the afterlife depended on it. Every step was prescribed, every prayer memorized, every action performed with reverence. The body was washed in natron salts. Internal organs were removed through a careful incision and placed in canopic jars. The brain was extracted through the nose. The body was dried for 40 days, then wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen, each layer accompanied by prayers and protective amulets. Finally, the jaw was bound shut with strips of cloth, ensuring the deceased would appear peaceful and whole in the afterlife. Unknown man received none of this dignity. When researchers unwrapped him years later, they discovered something that would haunt Egyptologists for over a century. He had been wrapped in sheepskin. In ancient Egypt, sheepskin was considered ritually unclean, an abomination. Wrapping a body in it was like condemning them to spiritual filth for eternity. It was the opposite of honor. It was deliberate humiliation. But the violations didn't stop there. His hands and feet were bound together, tied tight as if he'd been restrained when he died. There was no embalming incision, suggesting they had mummified him using an alternative method, perhaps to ensure his preservation while still denying him the traditional rites. And most disturbing of all, his jaw had never been bound. It hung open, locked in that terrible scream. The embalmers, the very people whose job was to ensure peaceful passage to the next world, had left him like this on purpose. This wasn't a burial. This was a statement. Whoever unknown man was, the ancient Egyptians wanted him preserved not out of respect, but as a warning. They wanted his shame to last forever. They wanted future generations to see what happens to those who commit the unforgivable. So what crime could possibly deserve this treatment? The answer may lie in one of the darkest chapters in Egyptian royal history, the harem conspiracy of 1155 BCE. Ramesses III was in the twilight of his reign. He had defended Egypt against multiple invasions. He had built temples that still stand today. He was one of the last truly great pharaohs of the new kingdom. But age was catching up with him, and in the shadows of his palace, ambition was growing deadly. His secondary wife, a woman named Tia, had a son, Prince Pentewere, intelligent, capable, but not in line for the throne. That honor belonged to another son from Ramesses' primary wife. Tia couldn't accept this. In her mind, Pentewere deserved to rule Egypt, and if the current order wouldn't allow it, then she would change the order herself. What followed was a conspiracy that reached into every corner of the palace. Tia recruited officials from the royal administration. She brought military commanders into the plot. She gathered women from the harem, each one bitter about their own lack of power. She even enlisted magicians, practitioners of ancient Egyptian magic, who created wax figurines meant to weaken the pharaoh's Ka, his life force. The plan was simple and unthinkable. Assassinate Ramesses III. Put Pentewere on the throne before anyone could react. Rewrite the succession before the kingdom even knew what had happened. They almost succeeded. Historical records suggest the conspirators reached Ramesses, possibly with a blade, possibly with poison. The king was wounded, but he didn't die immediately. And in those final days, Ramesses did something that would seal his legacy and doom the conspirators. He ordered trials, complete thorough investigations into everyone involved. The judicial papyrus of Turin, discovered thousands of years later, records the entire proceeding in meticulous detail. 38 people were arrested. The evidence was overwhelming. Confessions were extracted. Punishments were decided. For most conspirators, the sentence was execution, swift, brutal, final. But for certain individuals, particularly those of royal blood, Ramesses granted a strange mercy. They would be allowed to take their own death upon themselves. Forced suicide. It was a way to avoid the public humiliation of execution while still ensuring they paid for their treason. Give them poison or a blade, lock them in a room, and let them choose their moment. Prince Pentewere's fate is recorded in that papyrus. He was left in his place. He took his own death upon himself. Meaning the young prince, somewhere around 18 to 20 years old, was given the means to end his own life and ordered to use it. Now imagine his final moments, locked in a chamber, knowing his father is dying or already dead because of what he participated in, knowing there's no escape, knowing that in minutes or hours he'll cease to exist. He takes the poison they've given him. Perhaps he hesitates. Perhaps he drinks it quickly, hoping for a fast end. But poisons in the ancient world weren't clean. They caused convulsions, muscle spasms, agonizing pain that radiated through every nerve. His body would have twisted, his jaw would have clenched and unclenched, his limbs would have jerked violently as the toxins overwhelmed his system. And in those final seconds, as the darkness closed in, his face would have frozen in that terrible expression, the scream that would last 3,000 years. For decades, this was all theory. Compelling, yes. Historically probable, absolutely. But theories aren't proof. Unknown man, he could have been anyone. A prince who died in battle. A royal who succumbed to disease that distorted his features. A victim of circumstance rather than conspiracy. That is, until modern science entered the tomb. In 2012, researchers conducted a CT scan analysis of unknown man E. They slid his ancient body into a machine that would have seemed like pure magic to the embalmers who wrapped him. The images that emerged told a story the naked eye couldn't see. The mummy was approximately 18 to 20 years old when he died, exactly the age Pentewere would have been during the conspiracy. His teeth were excellent, showing he had eaten well throughout his life. No signs of manual labor on his bones. This was someone who had lived in luxury, who had never known a day of physical hardship. High status, royal even. But the CT scan revealed something else, something that made researchers pause and exchange uncomfortable glances. His body was locked in a position that suggested cadaveric spasm, a rare phenomenon that occurs during violent, traumatic death. When someone dies in extreme agony or terror, their muscles can freeze instantly, preserving their final position. Unknown man, E's entire body had locked up at the moment of death. The scream wasn't just his jaw falling open after death. He had died screaming. He had died in agony so intense that his muscles had seized, trapping that expression forever. Then came 2015, DNA testing, the final piece of evidence that would end all doubt. Genetic material was carefully extracted from unknown man E and compared against samples from other royal mummies. The Y chromosome analysis came back with results that sent shockwaves through the Egyptological community. Unknown man E and Ramesses III shared paternal DNA. They were related through the male line. Father and son. There was no more uncertainty, no more debate. Unknown man E was Prince Pentewere, the patricide who had helped murder one of Egypt's greatest kings. Picture the full story now. Pentewere, young and ambitious, is drawn into his mother's conspiracy. Perhaps he believes he deserves the throne. Perhaps he's manipulated. Perhaps he simply loves his mother and can't refuse her. The plot unfolds. His father is attacked, but instead of ascending to power, Pentewere watches everything collapse. His father dying orders the trials. One by one, the conspirators are arrested. His mother is likely executed, though the records are unclear. And then they come for him. Royal guards, officials he once commanded. They take him to a chamber and present him with a cup of poison. They tell him to drink. They leave him alone with his fate. He knows what that poison will do. He knows there's no antidote, no escape, no mercy. And when it hits his system, when the convulsions begin, when his body twists and his jaw locks open, he screams. Not a scream anyone will hear, just the silent, eternal scream that we're still witnessing thousands of years later. The embalmers faced a dilemma when they received Pentewere's body. He was still a prince. Royal blood still flowed in his veins, even if that blood was tainted by treason. They couldn't just throw him in a pit, but they also couldn't give him the honors reserved for legitimate pharaohs. So they created a punishment that would transcend death itself. They mummified him, yes, ensuring his body would last for millennia. But they did it wrong, deliberately, carefully, methodically wrong. The sheepskin wrapping, the bound limbs, the lack of identification, the open jaw. Every violation was intentional. Every deviation from protocol was a message. This is what happens when you betray a god king. This is what happens when you kill your father. Your body will last forever, but so will your shame. And then, in a final twist that seems almost poetic, they placed him in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari alongside the very pharaohs he had betrayed. Ramesses III was there. The father Pentewere had helped murder. For 3,000 years they rested in the same hidden chamber. The honored king and the screaming traitor, separated by mere meters of stone. Perhaps it was mercy, perhaps it was irony, or perhaps it was the ultimate punishment, ensuring that Pentewere would spend eternity in the presence of the man he had wronged. Some Egyptologists still raise questions. Why mummify him at all if he was a traitor? Why not just burn the body or feed it to animals, as was done with the worst criminals? Why include him in the royal cache? These are valid concerns, and they remind us that history rarely offers complete certainty. There are alternative theories. Maybe he died in battle, and the facial distortion came from battlefield trauma. Maybe he died of a disease that caused muscle contractions. Maybe the sheepskin wrapping was a mistake, or a later addition. But here's my perspective, and I say this after years of studying Egyptian funerary practices and royal succession. The evidence is too consistent to ignore. The DNA links him directly to Ramesses III. His age matches. His burial matches the description of a royal being punished but not entirely dishonored. The historical records describe Pentewere's forced suicide. And that scream, that terrible frozen scream, matches exactly what would happen if someone died from poison that caused violent convulsions. This is Prince Pentewere. This is the patricide. And what makes this story so devastating is that he was barely more than a teenager, 18, maybe 20 years old enough to make catastrophic choices, young enough to still be shaped by others. We'll never know if he truly believed in the conspiracy or if he was a pawn in his mother's ambition. We'll never know if he regretted it in those final moments as the poison worked through his system. All we have is that face, that eternal scream, a warning carved in human flesh that has lasted 30 centuries. Unknown man, he finally has his identity back. Prince Pentewere, son of Ramesses III, conspirator, patricide, eternal warning. His name was erased from official records, scratched off monuments, forbidden to be spoken. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak someone's name was to give them life in the afterlife. By removing his name, they killed him twice, once with poison, once with silence. But modern science has done what the ancients tried to prevent. We've brought his name back. We've given him identity. We've told his story. And in doing so, we've ensured that his punishment and his crime will never be forgotten. There's something deeply human about this story. Ambition, betrayal, family. The terrible weight of choices that can never be undone. Pentewere made a decision that cost him everything. His life, his legacy, his eternal soul, if the Egyptians were right. And yet 3,000 years later, we're still talking about him, still trying to understand what drove a son to kill his father, still staring into that frozen scream and wondering what thoughts raced through his mind in those final seconds. If this story captivated you, if you want to dive deeper into ancient Egypt's darkest secrets and most shocking mysteries, then do me a favor right now. Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because every single week I bring you stories like this. Stories they don't teach in school. Stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Drop a comment below telling me what other Egyptian mysteries you want uncovered. The curse of Tutankhamun, the lost labyrinth of Hawara, the mysterious death of Nefertiti. Your suggestions shape this channel. And if you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of history lover this community needs. Hit that like button to help others discover this story. Share it with anyone who thinks they know everything about ancient Egypt. Because the past isn't dead. It's screaming at us from across 3,000 years. And we're finally learning to listen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.